Welcome Bronco Nation and anyone else watching this video. This video potentially has a wider appeal to because it impacts other schools, impacts in fact every college football team, because we're talking about a fraudulent bias and broken system called the College Football Playoff Committee system that needs to be removed. It's not working. We tried the BCS. We tried that for years. There were a lot of complaints. There were a lot of short sides and downsides to that system. Teams' overall performance not being taken into account was a big one. One loss at the beginning of the year, really at any point in the year, could doom you. So we moved to a human factor, taking it off the computers, moved to a human factor that would take into account and be able to reason with the human mind. So if you just can't plug into algorithms, teams' overall performance and judge them based on that. However, the current system, the way that it's set up, is not working and it has to be replaced. This video is going to kind of go through all this. We'll kind of spark this off. I've had some of the videos where I've talked about this in parts of it, but I'm starting right now. All my video this week, I'm starting a new slogan that will go along with all my videos, which is cancel the College Football Playoff Committee, or cancel the CFP committee. And I realized I kind of stuck it in, at the end of my last two videos, and I didn't really explain why. And I kind of referenced each of the videos, like I'll explain it in that one. I never got around to it. So I'm going to explain it in this one, and overall why the committee needs to be gotten rid of. So first off, just off the bat here, we're going to go over the overall reasons, and then we're going to look at the specific rankings this year that really brought this to a head. The system has been broken pretty much from the get-go. The first year was actually okay, but pretty much from the get-go after that, the system has been broken and has had numerous flaws that have been kind of under the radar, but this year has really brought them to the head, and of course, in a 2020 COVID year, it would take something like that to bring it to a head, but finally these issues are really coming to light. They're getting much wider support. The heads of the AAC, American Athletic Conference, have already called for the BCS system to be reinitiated. I do not advocate that. I think that we do need a human factor along with a computer factor. I'll talk about my solution at the end of the video on how we fix this. But right now, let's go over the overalls, and then we'll look at the specifics of the rankings this year that brought this to the head. So overall, and this has been through for all the playoff rankings, they have shown these tendencies. They have shown a tendency to shut out the underdog or the smaller schools from the potentials. We're seeing this year with Cincinnati, but we saw it in the past with UCF. Unfortunately, my team, Boise State, hasn't been able to maintain an undefeated season all the way through to get into that conversation like they have in the past prior to the playoff rankings. But we have seen it with smaller schools and even big Power 5 schools that had incredible undefeated records. I mean, Minnesota a couple of years back was off to an incredible run and didn't get the respect that they should have from the committee just because they don't have the name brand. They're not historically known for that. So they weren't looking at their performance this year. They were looking at their performance historically as a program and their name recognition, which shouldn't be how this works out. It should be based on which team is the best that year, not which team has been best in the last 20 years. So that has been a consistent standard across the board, not taking the full season into account. Now, this is entirely the reason that the College Football Playoff Committee was started in the beginning, was so that a team that had a loss at the beginning of the season wouldn't be doomed and be completely shut out of getting into playoffs now, but the national championship. And it worked out great the first year. Ohio State lost to Virginia Tech, which normally would have doomed their season, but they came back, they won the rest of their games, they were dominant, they had incredible performance, and they went to the playoffs, deservedly so. And that's exactly why this system was put in place. However, now we're seeing where teams will lose a couple of games at the beginning of the season, and then they will be ranked ahead of teams that are undefeated or maybe only have one loss that they suffered kind of midway through the season. But because that team has maybe gone on an undefeated, say 7-0 streak or 5-0 or something like that towards the end of the season, and is playing pretty good dominant performance towards the end of the season, they will get the nod over a team that's played consistent all the way throughout and maybe had one game that hurt them, or has been undefeated throughout and been completely consistent and dominant throughout, but this other, and such as a group of 5 team, and this Power 5 team with 1 or 2 losses getting ranked ahead of this other team, and that, or even 3 or 4 losses once we get down to the 15 to 25 ranking section, and that is completely unjust. What they do in the beginning of the season shouldn't necessarily It shouldn't doom them. It shouldn't define their entire season, but it should also be taken into the account. Just because you lose one game and then, or say you lose one or two games and then you win the rest of the games, doesn't mean you're an undefeated team. You still have two losses that still need to be factored into that decision making, and there really aren't, especially this year, which we'll talk about. And then inconsistent and double standards. So some teams are being measured, it appears, against a certain standard, like, okay, we're going to look at your overall strength of schedule, and okay, one loss isn't going to kill you. And then other teams, oh, you have one loss, we're not even going to consider you, especially a group of 5 teams, East Coast teams, we're going to talk about, West Coast teams, talk about that in a second. But teams are being, the standards inconsistent and a double standard. And part of that, which is my next point, is that it's all happening behind closed doors. There's no accountability. The committee doesn't answer to anybody. They don't have any kind of oversight, and they don't, especially they are impacting over 130 FBS teams across the nation, and they don't have any accountability for their justifications. They're not required to. The reasoning that we get is very weak most of the time. Very weak, very bland, very general. These type of meetings, I'm not saying that they should be completely open doors. And the committee definitely shouldn't be feeling pressured by any other outside members on their choices. That's not what I'm saying. But we need a higher level of accountability to find out and know what is the decision-making criteria, to explain some of this better for why this is going on. Maybe have recorded sessions that are released at the end of the season, because a new committee rolls in every season, so we know why these decisions were made, so that there's higher accountability there. Or maybe the decision making process is even streamed, and the committee then just has to make sure they're not feeling pressured. There are alternatives to this closed door system, which we are not seeing right now. And then just to close up here, these are the two biggest issues: is Power 5 bias within the committee. Yes, Power 5 teams play a better schedule. That should be taken into account, but it shouldn't be the end all, the make all end all that the committee is making it. Group of 5 teams that beat a Power 5 team at the beginning of the season and then play great throughout shouldn't be penalized because they play in a less powerful league. A lot of teams that don't have a choice, they shouldn't be penalized because of that, especially when you look at how they performed at the beginning of the year with those Power 5 games. That performance is what they're capable of. They're just not getting the opportunity to show it. That should be taken more into account. A team shouldn't be given a death sentence and never be allowed to get into the top 4 to challenge for a playoff spot because they're in a group of 5 conference. And also there's a lot more parity in college football than there used to be. The difference between Power 5 and group of 5 is not that big as much as it used to be. Now, yes, when you get to the very top of the Power 5, when you're talking about the Alabamas, the Clemsons, the Notre Dames this year and pretty much throughout the rest of you know what I'm talking about, Ohio State's, when you're talking about the very top of the spectrum, yes, those teams they're not just the best in their Power 5, they're also going to be way above the average for most teams in the group of 5. But when you start talking about the middling to lower level, especially when you're talking about the lower end of the Power 5s, when you're talking about the Marylands, when you're talking about the Kentuckys, the Vanderbilts, the Louisvilles, especially after Lamar Jackson left, when you start talking about those schools, and then even the middling competition with some of the schools that are kind of usually in the mix a little bit, like Missouri and Auburn and Michigan and Iowa State, though this year they're actually pretty good, TCU, Baylor. When you start talking about those middling schools and the lower end, those schools have a lot of parity across the board. I mean, look at the Mountain West. Mountain West, their bottom end teams last year beat 2 of the bottom end SEC teams, but they beat them. San Jose State had a win against Arkansas, I believe it was, and UNLV beat Missouri. Those are the 2 of the worst teams, or they were last year. San Jose State's actually going to be in the Mountain West Championship game, but last year, those are 2 of the worst teams in the Mountain West, and they ended up pulling off big upsets against Power 5 teams on the lower end of the spectrum, showing the parity is much closer. So the Power 5 to G5 needs to be taken into account, but it is not as big a difference. I know a group of 5 teams, we're calling the Power 5 the Economy 5, and I like to use that term too, because it's not about really who has the skill positions, it's just about who has the more money, who can market, who has the brand name. That's the real issue at stake. The skill levels throughout the regular season, consistency. I mean, the Mountain West last year, I think it had 9 Power 5 wins over Power 5 schools. The parity between conferences is not that great. When you start talking about the worst in the Power 5, such as, like, say, the Sun Belt, usually they're actually pretty good this year, but Sun Belt and the MAC tendencies, some of those may be a little bit different, especially when you start talking about the Mountain West and the American Athletic Conference. For sure, that parity is much greater, and even with those other conferences, it's not as big a gap as it is led on to believe, and those games should be taken into a higher account overall. And then finally, East Coast bias. There is definitely a heavy East Coast bias. There always has been for the AP, but there definitely is for the College Football Playoff Committee. Part of that is because of the time. Well, the reason for that is because of the timing of the games, and because of the overall distances, or on the other side of the country, kind of the Mountain West, the Pac-12, their own league over there. But those teams generally tend to play very later games, especially the Mountain West tends to play later games. When you look at the Mountain West American Athletic Conference, those conferences are basically equal. They really are. When you look at the true competitive level of their top to mid-tier teams, so the Boise States, Air Force, San Diego State, Nevada, Utah State, not this year, but generally speaking, even Colorado State, usually, when you look at their top tier teams, those teams are competing and winning at the same level routinely as the American Athletic Conference teams. But the American Athletic Conference teams are getting ranked higher. So, for instance, SMU didn't play anybody, and they get 3-0 in the AP polls, 3-0, they're getting into the top 25. San Jose State is sitting at 5-0. They had to get to 6-0 to get into the rankings. They had to get to 5-0 to get into the AP polls. They had to get to 6-0 to get into the AP polls. San Jose State playing in the Mountain West, this isn't the Sun Belt or Conference USA. We're talking about this is the Mountain West, and they took that much to get them into the rankings. Those teams, when we talk about cross-division games between the Mountain West and American Athletic Conference, those games are very even. A lot of times Mountain West coming out on top overall number of wins. When we talk about bowl wins, Mountain West often wins a higher number of bowl wins. And Power 5 wins, the Mountain West usually wins a higher number of Power 5, and they definitely did last year, where the AAC, I think, only won like 6 or so Power 5 games, and the Mountain West was winning between 9 and 12. Actually, when you count in the Missouri and the Arkansas game at the end, it was like 12 or 14 Power 5 wins. And you can go back and look up those exact numbers, but it was a much larger percentage than the American Athletic Conference. And yet, even that last year, American Athletic Conference teams were getting the higher nod, getting put higher in the rankings. Their inner competition was being counted as higher and better standard than that of the Mountain West inner competition, just playing each other. And that has to go with East Coast bias. And we'll talk about this as well. But again, also looking at the Pac-12, it impacts how they're ranked as well. Big 12 to a certain extent, the Big 10, ACC, and the SEC get a higher nod undeservedly over those other conferences. A lot of that has to do with the East Coast bias that this committee has. So let's look at the rankings this year that have really drawn this to the top. So the things that have really drawn this to the top is 4 things: decision to rank, decision not to rank, overrank, and underrank. So first, decision to rank. These 3 teams proved that the playoff committee, especially this year, and in general, has lost all credibility. They decided to rank Iowa. Iowa wasn't even on the horizon for the AP, and I still don't think Iowa should be ranked. Iowa right now is ranked at number 19. They had a loss at the start of the season to Purdue and Northwestern. Now, Northwestern is a little bit of a better team this year, so that's not as bad, but Purdue is 2-4. They're garbage. They have wins against Minnesota, Michigan State, Nebraska, and Illinois. All of those teams have even or losing records. In fact, all of them have losing records except for Minnesota, who is 3-3. And against Nebraska and Illinois, they only won by 6 points against Nebraska, and they were down by 13-14 at half against Illinois, and required a massive comeback to beat them. Those teams are garbage. Iowa should not be in the top 25 right now, but they are because of the biases by the committee. Missouri. Not ranked now, but they were last week at 5-3. Missouri started off the season 0-2 with a loss to Alabama. Can't really fault them for that. Everyone loses to Alabama. But they also lost to Tennessee in a massive blowout. Tennessee right now, I think they have 3 wins, 3-5, I think is what Tennessee's record is right now. They had a massive blowout to Tennessee. Now you say, okay, well, yeah, but what did they do since then? Maybe that is what counts. Well, they weren't competitive in any of their top 25 matchups. They lost again to they also have a loss to Florida, where they didn't look competitive in that. They didn't really look competitive in the game against Alabama, and they haven't beaten anybody. When you look at Missouri's rankings, and I'm unable to pull them up right now. Sorry, the teams that they've played, they are the bottom end of the SEC. We're talking, I believe it was Kentucky, South Carolina, who had to fire their head coach, and they didn't even, I don't think they beat Auburn. Their rankings, I mean, you should go look them up. They are truly atrocious, the teams that Missouri has played. They did not deserve. They weren't put in the top 25 by the AP poll, deservedly, and they shouldn't have been in the top 25 for the CFP. And I mean, the reason that they got into that is because they beat Arkansas. Arkansas 50-48. Arkansas is not a good football team. They should not have been put in the rankings above that, especially the teams. The decision not to rank, we're going to talk about here in a second. And then this week, decision to keep Colorado in the rankings at number 25. Colorado is 4-1. They had a blowout loss to 2-2, 1-2 coming in Utah by 17 points. They've beaten UCLA, Stanford, San Diego State, and Arizona. All of those teams have been very close games, and all those teams, with perhaps the exception of Stanford and UCLA, San Diego State and UCLA, are not good teams, especially Arizona. That again was another two touchdown game that they ended up winning that by. Two touchdown deficit. I can give you the exact score here if it'll pull up. Yeah, 24-7-13. Sorry, it wasn't even a 2 touchdown deficit. 24-13 is all he won. 11 points against Arizona, who has not won a game this year, and they are in the top 25 over these other two teams. So the decision not to rank, the College Football Playoff Committee has kept both these teams out of the ranking, and this is the other fault on them, the other disqualifying factor on the College Football Playoff Committee. Liberty is outside the rankings right now at 9-1. Liberty is 9-1. They have wins over 2 Power 5 programs in Syracuse, who I know isn't very good, but they have a win over Virginia Tech, who is a pretty good, middle of the tier. I think they're 6th right now, or in the ACC, but they're still a pretty good a Power 5 team, maybe not the standard that they want to be usually, but Liberty has also, especially at the beginning of the season, not so much, but in the last 6 games, Liberty has been dominant in all of their group of 5 games that they have played, and their only loss of the year is a 1-point loss, 13-14 against number 20, currently ranked number 22 NC State. A 1-point loss. They are 9-1. They have shown themselves to be dominant in most of their performances. They've had a great defensive performance in the second half of the season. They have an incredible quarterback in Malik Willis, and Coach Freeze is one of the top coaching candidates in the nation because of the job he's done with Liberty. And Liberty is outside the rankings at 9-1, and they ranked Colorado. They ranked Missouri last week, and Colorado this week ahead of Liberty. That is inexcusable, absolutely preposterous, and there's no defense for that decision right there. That is one of the biggest disqualifying factors. Everything else I listed as well, but that is one of the most inexcusable decision makings, and it can only be chalked up to bias. There is no reason that Liberty should be on the outside of the top 25 right now. No reason. I write a weekly article for A Sea of Red, which is a Liberty-specific sports magazine, and every single prediction, yes, I am also a Liberty fan addition to Boise State. Every single team that I have predicted will either fall the rankings or come into the rankings has come into the rankings except for Liberty. There's no reason that Liberty should not be ranked. My analysis is perfect on this point, statistically and reason-wise and logic-based and whatever you want to throw at it. There is no reason that Liberty should be on the outside of the top 25 right now, yet they are. It's ridiculous, and it is only because of the committee's biases and one of the biggest disqualifying factors for the committee. Buffalo is another team. I wouldn't put them ahead of Liberty, but I would put them ahead of Colorado. They are 5-0. Yes, they're playing the MAC. Yes, the MAC is only playing intercompetition. There's no outside factors. Yes, the MAC is not very good this year with a lot of teams having multiple losses, even playing themselves. But Buffalo has been dominant. They're 5-0. They're undefeated. They've been dominant in every single matchup. They have put up 51.8 points per game, including a 70-point performance against Kent State, and they have only allowed 21 points overall average on defense, with a couple of 7-point matchups in there as well. They have done an incredible job all season long so far, 5-0, and they're playing another game against Ball State, I think it is. They have had an incredible job all season long, and they deserve to be ranked ahead of Colorado, maybe if not ahead of some of the other top 25 teams necessarily, but definitely ahead of Colorado. And the decision not to rank either Liberty or Buffalo is indefensible and inexcusable by the committee. Okay, so this last 2 columns here, overranked. So they have overranked teams consistently throughout the year. Right now, looking at the teams in the rankings, we have, let's just go top to bottom. So number 21, OSU, who is sitting with 3 losses right now. They're currently outside of the AP poll, as they should be. One of those losses to TCU is not having a great year this year. I think they're 4-5. or maybe they're 5-4. But TCU on the outside, not having a great year this year, and Oklahoma State at 7-3 is ranked at number 21 over some of these other more deserving teams that I've talked about. I think that 21 is maybe an okay, maybe not as, but it as indefensible as some of these other decisions, but it is questionable, and that's just starting us off looking at there. Okay, number 13. Apologies, not 15. Number 13, USC. USC is undefeated right now. Yes, at 5-0, but they have played absolutely one of the worst schedules in the country, and they should not be in the top 15 right now. Should they be ranked? Yes, I think they should be ranked. Should they be in the top 20? Probably not. So they have won. They have a 1-point win against Arizona State, who is 1-2. They have a 4-point win against Arizona, who's 0-5, and they have a 5-point win against UCLA, who's 3-3. They also held a win against Washington State, who's okay. But those victories right there, 1, 4, and 5, are not deserving of the number 13 team in the nation. They're definitely not deserving of being ranked ahead of a team such as BYU or even Louisiana or right behind a team such as Coastal Carolina. It is absolutely a disgrace that USC, and it's only because of their history and their prestige that they are ranked this high. Pure bias, no factors, no stats that are factoring into that. They should, or logic or reason, they should not be in the top 15 for sure at USC. But now we'll get to the two biggest ones, the two biggest, most overranked teams in the country. Iowa State. And you know what? Iowa State, I have a lot more to say about them. We'll start with Ohio State. Ohio State right now is ranked at 5-0. The combined record of Ohio State's opponents, if you take out Indiana, is 8-20. They have Ohio State's opponents that they've beaten 5-0. If you take out Indiana, they've won 8 games and lost 20. Every single one of them has 5 losses. And Indiana, yes, 6-1, they're actually a decent team, but they only beat them by like a touchdown. It was a close game. Definitely not deserving of being in the top 5. Should be in the top 10. Yeah, I think so, based on the way that they've dominated most of their other games. But they have played an absolutely garbage schedule and should not be ranked number 4 right now. They should not be ranked ahead of Texas A&M. They should not be ranked ahead of Cincinnati. And there's some other teams on this list that you look at they should not be ranked ahead of. But they definitely should not be ranked in the top 4 right now. That is an absolutely mind-boggling that they are there. There's no reason other than playoff bias, committee bias. Finally, let's look at Ohio State here for teams that are overranked that led to this degrading of the committee's overall prestige, authority, whatever you want to call it. Iowa State, at 2 losses, jumped Cincinnati into the top 10, and they're now sitting at number 6, moving up 1 slot. They have 2 losses this season. One of those losses is to Louisiana Lafayette. Now, when you talk about 1 loss not dooming a team season, maybe that should be taken into, that should definitely be taken into a factor. But when you're comparing them against other teams that are undefeated, such as Cincinnati, or even other teams in the who've played a much tougher schedule in the SEC with 2 losses to that 2 losses, they should not be at number 6, and they should not be ahead of Cincinnati. That is absolutely ridiculous that they are ranked that high with a loss to Louisiana Lafayette on the schedule. Now, having said that, if Louisiana Lafayette and Coastal Carolina were ranked higher and there was more parity in the rankings, then maybe you could justify it. And that's what we'll look at next. Under-ranking teams. That's the final category here. So we'll just throw this. We'll just talk about Louisiana Lafayette and Coastal Carolina. Not in order of rankings, but just talk about them. So Louisiana Lafayette. Okay, if you're going to say to Iowa State that that loss, we're not going to count as far against you, we're still going to count you in the top 10. That's fine if you use the same judgment then for Louisiana Lafayette. So this is that inconsistency and double standard that I was talking about. Louisiana Lafayette, their only other loss is to Coastal Carolina, and they beat Iowa State, who is a top 6 team right now. They should not be all the way down at number 19. They should be in the top 15. If Iowa State is going to be ranked, I don't think that Iowa State should be ranked ahead of Louisiana Lafayette because you're going on head-to-head matchups. That's what you're talking about. That's what matters, right? Those teams scheduling those head-to-head matchups, going out, finding the best competition. Well, Louisiana Lafayette did that this year, and they're still being held out, showing that the committee is just full of hypocrisy and lies. That's all it is just try and get the group of 5 off their back so they continue to play their little games, the little game of bias and dice, and figure out who they're going to rank in the rankings. It's absolutely ridiculous. So if you're going to say, okay, Louisiana Lafayette doesn't deserve to be ranked as high as perhaps they could otherwise because they lost to Coastal Carolina. That's fine. If you're going to then say that the loss to Coastal Carolina is what's keeping them out, then you need to count that win that Louisiana Lafayette has against Iowa State. Count that as Louisiana Lafayette being a good team. Count that win for Coastal Carolina. Coastal Carolina right now is 11-0 with a win over Louisiana Lafayette, who beat Iowa State. They should definitely be ranked ahead of Iowa State. They should probably be in the top 10. The fact that they're only at number 12 is absolutely ridiculous. They have a better resume with better wins potentially than any of these other teams that are competing ahead of them, any of the other these other 1 or 2 lost teams. And they have, if you look at it really, logically based here, statistically, they have a win, technically speaking, against Iowa State on their schedule because they beat Louisiana Lafayette, who beat Iowa State, and that's kind of how it flows there. And that win should be being counted in how they're being factored. Because Carolina, little team from the Sun Belt, no name brand, only joined the FBS I think 5 years ago. Nobody cares about them, and the bias plays in. Oh, we don't even know who this team is. We're not going to rank you regardless of your performance this year. You know why? Because we haven't watched your games. That's the biggest issue with this playoff committee. That's why the bias reigns in, the East Coast bias. The committee isn't staying up and watching these games. They're not making sure they're getting all of the group of 5 games on the schedule. When I'm watching college football on the weekend, I have 8 games going, and that is a minimum of 8 games. Usually I'll throw in another computer and get maybe 10 or 12 if we got all the games going at one time. I make sure I'm watching every single football game that I can throughout, and if I'm not watching a football game, if I don't see any of it, I'm not going to talk to it. And that's how the playoff committee should be. They are responsible for ranking all the teams in the nation. Now, if a team is, they're 0-5, you don't need to watch their games because you're not going to rank them. But any team that is in competition for being ranked, especially at the beginning of the season, towards mid, you need to be watching every one of their games. And there is no way that they are. And that leads me into BYU. BYU is also one of those underranked teams. Now, yeah, they lost to Coastal Carolina. I'm not saying that right now they should be in the top 10. But when the rankings came out, BYU was undefeated. They were playing dominant. Yeah, they didn't have the win-loss columns for the teams, their opposing opponents, but they had all the wins in their column. And even though their strength of schedule might have been great, they were dominant in all of those games, and that should have been factored into the consideration. And it was like the committee hadn't even watched any of their games. It was like they hadn't seen them play. And if you're not going to watch, now again, because we don't have open doors, we don't know what the factors are, we don't know how they're discussing this, we don't know how aware they are of the games that have been played and if they've watched it. But I tell you, if you haven't watched every single game and you're sitting on that committee, you should not be voting. You should excuse yourself, recuse yourself, whatever, and not be voting on the games because you don't have the know-how. You can't look at a stat performance the next day, look at the highlights, and make a decision off of that. You have to have seen it. You have to have lived it. You have to have breathed it. You have to have actually know what the team is capable of by watching them play, and that's the only way that can be done. And that's how that East Coast bias factors in there because the East Coast games are earlier. They get more of the prime time. They're easier to watch than the Mountain West. Kind of going off on a little bit of a sidetrack there. But yes, underranked BYU, Louisiana Lafayette, and Coastal. And that brings us to the big one, the granddaddy of them all for underranked teams, Cincinnati. 8-0, has had an incredible season. They entered the rankings at number 7, which was underranked in my perspective. I think they should have been at maybe number 6 or number 5. But anyhow, they entered the rankings at number 7. Has had 2 weeks of not being able to play due to the COVID, and every single week after that they have dropped. They've gone from number 7 to number 9. That is absolutely ridiculous. They have 3 teams with 2 losses or more ahead of them. 3 teams with 2 losses or more ahead of them. Absolutely ridiculous. Florida, Georgia, and Iowa State. We've already talked about Iowa State. Georgia, with their record, they shouldn't be ahead 7-2. They shouldn't be ahead of Cincinnati. And that brings me to one team that I forgot to leave out, or did I? I've left it out now so I could talk about it. Saved it, rolled around. Florida is probably the most overranked team in the nation. I said it was Iowa State, but right now it's probably Florida. Last week they lost to LSU, who was 3-5 coming to that game. LSU has been absolutely garbage. They are taking themselves out of bowl games. How gracious. They weren't going to a bowl game anyway. They're taking themselves out of a bowl game so they can investigate themselves. They've had players dropping left and right. They just lost their top receiver who decided to not play the rest of the year. This is not just a bad LSU team. This is probably one of the worst LSU teams in program history, at least in the last 20 years. And Florida lost to them. They should be out of the top 10. I think that they should be maybe into 14 or 15 and struggling to stay in the top 15. They dropped 1 spot. 1 spot. And they stayed ahead of Cincinnati. That is absolutely one of the most unjustifiable actions that the committee has taken. I keep saying that word, but really, pretty much every ranking that the committee has come out with has just been absolutely inexcusable. Just an absolute crime committed against Cincinnati on the part of the committee, keeping Florida not only in the top 10, now Florida's at a position, if they beat Alabama, they could be into the playoffs. Potentially, they could be into the playoffs. Depending on how bad they beat them, depending on what loses ahead of them, but they're still in the playoff hunt. They should not be in the playoff hunt. It's like the committee. Had a predisposed plan of where they wanted these teams, and they're not even looking at the games anymore. They're just saying, okay, we feel like teams should be going here, and we're just going to put them there regardless. Absolutely ridiculous that a team should lose to LSU and stay in this year and stay in the top 10. Absolutely mind-boggling. So. And then just to go back to what I was saying, Cincinnati, yeah, they've had a great year. I think right now, if I was putting Cincinnati's in the rankings, I'd definitely put them ahead of Georgia. I'd put them ahead of Florida. I'd put them ahead of Iowa State. I'd probably put them right behind Texas A&M at number 6. Waiting for just a little bit of magic to happen, a little bit of craziness to jump into the playoffs. The committee has said that they're not excluding Group of Five, that it is going that we don't have 2 divisions in college football, that everyone is eligible. Well, that's true. Cincinnati should be higher ranked than they are right now, but it's not. Like I said, the committee's full of lies. They're full of hypocrisy. The system is broken. So that brings me to my solution. What do we need to fix? I know I'm at 30 minutes. This has been one of my longer videos. I apologize for that. However, it had to be said, and we're going to say it. So, what is the solution to all of this? Well, the solution to all of this is a system that relies on human factor and computers. We don't need a system that's all computers, that doesn't have any ability to look into the overall performance of a team and to factor in extenuating circumstances, things like that, where players are out due to injury and they come back. BCS isn't able to handle that. Only a human factor can handle that. But then again, human factors, they have bias. All of us have bias. I mean, look at me. I have bias. I know I have bias. We all have bias. But good analysts are going to be able to get beyond that bias. Now, even with the best committees, there are still going to be bias. And this committee is not. This committee is not able to look beyond their bias. And a couple of the committees have not been able to look beyond their bias at all. And there's been general biases throughout. But even the best committees who are trying to look beyond their biases are still going to be biased. It's just human nature. Your biases are the worldview that you look through. You're going to be unable to see. Everyone sees the world differently based on the things going on inside of their head, and they're not going to be able to look beyond those. Even if they're trying the best of their abilities, they can minimize it, but they can't look beyond it. So we need something that minimizes it, something that takes into account statistical performances, that takes into account hard data and logic, which cannot be biased, that takes into account and helps override those biases and acts as a safety measure, acts as a check to the powers of the committee. So we need to bring back the BCS, but we also need to keep the playoff committee. We need something that's about a 60-40 split. 60% human factor with a playoff committee that needs to be vetted better, by the way. I don't know how I'm not entirely sure of the process of how they pick the committees, but however they're doing about it, it is completely wrong. They need much more Group of Five representation in there, representing all of college football, not just the Power Five, with people who are going to be more well-versed and better analysts than the current committee we have in there right now. That's just off the bat. But a better vetted committee that takes up 60% of the vote and is able to help overcome those other factors that the computers can't take into account, and then 40% BCS that's able to factor out. Now, in the old BCS system, we did have some human factor. The coaches poll made a tiny percentage. It was like 3% or something. It might have been more than that, but it was small enough that it didn't make a ton of difference. But the coaches poll did have some factors with like 90% or so computers that it was fighting against. So we don't need that. We don't need that again where we're fighting against computers and there's no understanding. But we also need a system that's not completely based on biased, broken, flawed human beings. So 60% 60% playoff committee, 40% BCS. That's the solution. That's how we fix this going forward. However, as of right now, the current playoff committee playoff committee standard and system has to be gotten rid of. The 4-team playoff system, there's a lot of questions about it, a lot of disputes, but it will work if we can get the right ranking system in there that gives Group of 5 teams the chance that they deserve. But right now, there's no chance, and the Group of 5 and the playoff system is completely broken, and overall, the committee system is not working. So that explains my new hashtag that I'm adding to all of mine, which is all of my videos, which is hashtag cancel the CFP playoff committee. Thank you for watching this video. I know it was a lot longer. If you are a Boise State fan watching this, make sure to join Bronco Nation Updates page. We have over 8,000 other members. Otherwise, from time to time, I am Boise State centric in most of my videos, but from time to time, I do release videos that impact other teams. Make sure you keep an eye out for that, and make sure to like and subscribe if you like this video. All right, thank you so much, and as always, sorry, this is the second time I'm doing this. As always, cancel the CFP playoff committee and go Big Blue.